Nearly 50 years ago in Santiago, Chile, the first democratically elected socialist leader in South America was overthrown by a military coup. Beset by economic problems, social tumult, and a weak political mandate, Salvador Allende struggled to retain his grip on Chile, and on September the 11th, 1973, he became the first victim of a brutal dictatorship that would last for 17 years. The commander-in-chief of the Chilean military, Augusto Pinochet, would herald in that dictatorship atop the bludgeoned corpse of a democracy that died with Allende. The circumstances surrounding his demise and Pinochet's rise to power have been a perennially contested subject, with many on the left arguing that US clandestine intervention in Chile was the principal cause of Allende's ignominious end. Conversely, the right and many employed by US intelligence services have routinely rebuked the claims that the United States had a hand in the collapse of the Allende government. What was the true backdrop to the final years of Chilean democracy? One of incompetence, mismanagement, and a failed project of constitutional revolution? Or one of sinister meddling by a foreign power that encouraged, funded, and supported efforts to undermine Allende's socialist experiment? To answer these questions, we delve deep into the muddied waters of 70s Chile and the ever-furtive sediment of American intelligence bureaus such as the CIA. It is not surprising that many assume that the United States had a hand in the coup of 1973. The US had been involved with numerous efforts to preempt the rise of anti-American governments and socialist governments in South and Central America since the beginning of the 20th century. In the early to mid-1900s, US interventionism in the Caribbean and Central America was not uncommon, with the United States invading and occupying islands that belonged to the Spanish Empire, including Puerto Rico, which still remains a US territory today. They also invaded independent island republics on the pretext for maintaining stability, and it would take years for them to see full independence, with Santo Domingo and Haiti being occupied until 1924 and 1934 respectively. When the United States did elect to leave, they ensured that the Caribbean islands would remain amenable to US influence. In that vein, the United States established the Platt Amendment in 1901, a provision that ensured the United States was empowered to intervene in Cuba if it impeded on US interests in the region. They also propagated so-called control zones to nations in and around the Caribbean in order to establish, as the historian Emily Rosenberg describes, economic supervisory regimes appointed by the US executive branch. The precedent set by the Spanish-American War of 1898 of enacting control over its counterparts in Latin America spilled over into the rest of the century, with the United States increasingly seeking to maintain order as to ensure challenges to US objectives in its sphere of influence were kept to a minimum. The US became, in the words of the historian Alexandre Decamp, a police power with the objective of dissuading doctrines errant of US free market liberalism. It became a power that demanded the states in its sphere of influence pursued an economic open-door policy, and eyed isolated governments in Latin America with great caution and derision. The United States would continue to pursue interventionist policies, with brief respite under Herbert Hoover's Good Neighbor policy, well into the mid to late 20th century, intervening in Guatemala, Cuba, and Brazil, to cite a few, all in the name of preventing the rise of socialist governments, or those sympathetic to socialism, from establishing themselves in the Americas. For these reasons, there has been a significant intellectual undercurrent that has contended that US involvement in Chile was all but guaranteed, not least because Allende was a breed of socialist that the United States viewed as particularly pernicious, being not only a Marxist but an ardent critic of the US government and a proponent of Chilean economic independence. The latter frustrated US strategic imperatives with respect to open-door business interests and the rest exacerbated the hostile dynamic between the US and Chile. The US had historically been open to allowing the continuation of socialist governments if they were A. outside of the US geostrategic bubble, and B. a state generally averse to cooperation with Moscow, which is why the United States elected to pursue non-intervention when it came to Yugoslavia and China. Chile did not have the same luxury. It was in the US's backyard and had strong ideological ties with Cuba, this being particularly relevant as the United States wished to avoid at all costs the, quote, appearance of another Fidel Castro in the US hemisphere, end quote. Consequently, the United States moved swiftly to attempt to prevent the rise of another socialist state, potentially sympathetic to Moscow, from rising in Chile. They began funding parties that opposed Allende's Frente de Acción Popular as early as August of 1962, with the former ambassador to Chile, Edward M. Corey, stating that the US expended in excess of $12 million on opposition parties in order to defeat Allende in 1964, only $3 million of which came from the CIA. Much of this money, as it appears, was used to fund covert action projects that intended to mobilize slum dwellers and funnel funds into opposition parties. The US also engaged in a massive anti-communist propaganda campaign, in which the CIA, in cooperation with opposition parties, as well as independently, deployed a comprehensive attack on the FARP via press, radio, films, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, direct mailings, paper streamings, and wall paintings. The true monetary cost of US support of opposition parties is not fully known, but Ambassador Corey estimated that it was in the tens of millions. The election of 1964 ultimately resulted in Eduardo Frei, the leader of the Christian Democrats, obtaining an absolute majority in the Chilean Congress, winning 56% of the vote, while Allende lagged behind at roughly 39%. This initial success did not, however, dissuade the CIA from continuing its efforts to undermine the electoral prospects of Allende and his Socialist Party. In the next election, a further $2 million were expended on covert action projects, with the intention of strengthening the new opposing candidate, Jorge Alessandri, and his centre-right coalition, while weakening the socialist camp. In this round of meddling, the United States also opted to run a spoiling campaign that intended to undermine a new leftist coalition under the name of the Unidad Popular in 1969, and worked again to prop up the Christian Democrats and mend political divisions on the centre and the right that threatened to divest them of much-needed radical voters. Unfortunately for the US government, their efforts were not successful in denying Allende the presidency, as the Christian Democrats were defeated in 1970, and this would prompt the US to take more radical action. When news reached Washington of Allende's victory, there was uproar. Nixon, the President of the United States, declared that an Allende regime in Chile was unacceptable, and on September 15th instructed the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, to, quote, save Chile. The Nixon administration pursued a two-track approach, the first in which a combined political and economic campaign sought to preempt Allende's inauguration via a constitutional path. This path would have endeavored to bribe or otherwise convince a number of Chilean congressmen to vote against the inauguration of Allende, and instead vote for Alessandri, who would then promptly resign, paving the way for Eduardo Frei, the current president, to pursue re-election shortly thereafter. This plan never materialized, primarily because Frei could not be induced to partake due to a lack of party support, and Allende had formulated a contingency plan in the event of a constitutional challenge to his election. The other initiative, to convince Frei to replace several of his cabinet with members of the military, to instate a military government, was also scuppered, as it was deemed unworkable. The economic branch of Track 1 was a coordinated effort to, quote, make the economy scream, end quote, as President Nixon had directed Helms to do in his now infamous note. This branch included a scare campaign that utilized the media to create an environment of economic panic, causing massive numbers of Chileans to run for the banks to withdraw their money. According to Nathaniel Davis, the next ambassador to Chile, the economy was severely affected by the US's economic destabilization project, but this had little effect in incentivizing the military to take action, as was the intention of the US government. The second track of US interventionism was far more sinister. It is known by two names, Track 2 and Project Fubelt. This track intended to incite a coup within Chile before Allende could be inaugurated, and according to Nixon was meant to circumvent the embassy in Santiago and the ambassador David Corrie and coordinate military action against Allende. This clandestine organ of US foreign policy would pursue a campaign of coercion and subterfuge, ultimately culminating in the death of René Schneider. On the morning of the 22nd of October 1970, the commander-in-chief of the Chilean military, René Schneider, was assassinated by a cadre of military gunmen shortly after they intercepted his personal vehicle. The killers, led by retired Brigadier General Roberto Vio, had initially hoped to kidnap Schneider, believing his removal would trigger a military coup. Schneider was seen as one of the main columns of constitutionalism that would have dissuaded the wider military from taking action against Allende's government, and as such his removal may have opened the doors for military intervention. However, the kidnapping went awry, with Schneider drawing his weapon and attempting to repel the assailants, resulting in his death. Naturally, the killing had the opposite of the intended effect, with the country immediately rallying behind Allende, who was inaugurated 12 days later, according to Jack Devine, a CIA officer that was stationed in Chile in the 70s. It turned out that the CIA was heavily involved in the fiasco, with officials pressuring members of the Santiago station to act swiftly and decisively to remove Schneider from the picture in order to galvanize a coup. As such, the US government had collaborated with the plotters, via the exceptionally well-connected military attaché to Santiago, Paul M. Wimmert, providing submachine guns and tear gas to facilitate the kidnapping attempt, and were thus very much condoning and supporting the attack on Chilean democracy. Although the CIA attempted to extricate themselves from any responsibility, it appeared that they had been implicated too heavily for them to plead any reasonable deniability, to such an extent that Wimmert felt, quote, scared to death because so many things led back to him. Officially, the Nixon administration altered course following the bungled Schneider scheme, with the focus shifting to supporting political opponents and keeping anti-American sentiments to a minimum in order to deprive Allende of a clear enemy to unite behind. The US certainly did start to divert funding and resources towards other measures, not meant to be interpreted as direct interventionism. They provided $2 million in funds for the newspaper El Mercurio, a prestigious publication highly critical of the Allende government, in order to save them from bankruptcy. According to Jack Devine, El Mercurio was never a US propaganda organ, yet did emphasize negative aspects of the Allende government, quote, between the lines, which still indicates that the US was trying to sow discontent via the media. Indeed, El Mercurio, as well as the likes of Cepa and Tribuna, were some of the most ardent voices of agitation in the summer of 1973, setting their sights on creating conflict and confrontation against Allende's administration. Additionally, the United States provided in excess of $1.6 million directly to the opposition, in addition to an unknown amount of funds provided via their allies in business. Grants were distributed, unions opposed to the Unidad Popular were supported monetarily, and money found its way to militant groups on the right. Allegedly, the CIA even supported the critical truckers' strike that heralded in almost insurmountable opposition to Allende in 1972, and supported a myriad of other strikes in the summer of '73. The CIA was on a warpath, but not a traditional one. It wished to magnify the tumult that had taken hold of the Chilean economic and political system, and it planned to use Allende's stubborn adherence to democratic avenues in the face of economic disaster and an opposition increasingly willing to eschew constitutional solutions against him. Allende's refusal to pursue military solutions to these crises would be his downfall, and a downfall that the United States was primed to hasten. There is some evidence to suggest that the United States pursued another approach alongside these measures. Jonathan Haslam argues that the US again used a dual-track system, such as the one employed in the first attempt against the Allende government. He argues that the executive branch of the United States bypassed the Santiago embassy and its ambassador Nathaniel Davis, as well as the 40 Committee and most of the CIA's cohort, by establishing a surveillance network via the Chilean naval headquarters and the US naval mission in Valparaiso, rather than via the CIA station and its contacts in the military. While the creation of this surreptitious communication network doesn't immediately prove that the United States was the architect of Allende's demise, it begs a number of questions. For one, what reason would the United States have wanted to block the flow of information to official communication channels? This one we can answer quite easily. The Nixon administration wanted to create the climate for a coup, yet wished to hide its hand by reducing a paper trail. It endeavoured to obfuscate its influence and ensure that the US implication in what was to come was kept to a minimum. Indeed, it appeared that the Navy was the perfect environment for collaboration. It proved to be the department least accessible by far-left infiltration by the likes of MIR, as exemplified by the failed attempt by several MIR operatives to seize the warship Blanco Encalada. As such, the naval ranks provided the perfect staging ground for the coup, and may have perhaps even provided cover for US assistance in monitoring. Carlos Prats, Allende's commander-in-chief, asserted that the Navy was the fulcrum of the coup, and that José Toribio Merino, the naval commander-in-chief, was in constant contact with a US military attaché prior to the coup against Allende. Additionally, the previously mentioned MIR operatives who attempted to infiltrate the Navy also acknowledged learning of communications between the US naval mission and Naval High Command. Thus, it appears clear that the US clandestine actions persisted. Naturally, however, given the nature of US clandestine operations, the extent of US participation in the coup is not known, but one can surmise that their extensive surveillance networks would surely have been used to assist the plotters at the very least. Successive intelligence officials have repudiated the allegations of performing an auxiliary role to the coup, not least Ambassador Nathaniel Davis and Jack Devine, both of whom worked at the Santiago station in Chile. As already established, however, the Santiago station was routinely sidelined and ill-informed of the intentions of the executive branch, and as such these intelligence officials may not have been aware of wider meddling. Unfortunately, the information currently available to the public precludes a definitive conclusion with regards to this topic. Despite the claims of multiple historians stating they acquired authoritative data from anonymous sources, it is impossible to determine whether the assertions are apocryphal or not and must be treated with a grain of salt. What can be said for certain, however, is that the United States explicitly targeted and exacerbated the wounds of the Allende government, and as Henry Kissinger stated after the coup itself, created the conditions for a coup as great as possible. Ultimately, it appears, regardless of the US's accessory to his suicide, Allende would have likely met with the same fate. This of course does not excuse US involvement, but should still be noted as to not imply that the United States wielded the fate of the country in its hands absolutely. Allende faced problems from the outset of his presidency, and was perennially beset by his own fixation on mediation, constitutionality, and belief in the myth of Chilean exceptionalism. He often vacillated between inaction, conceit, and delusion as to the capacity for the Chilean political system to exclude itself from barbarism and authoritarianism. He believed that the military would never tread on the toes of democracy, remaining forever an apparatus of the constitution. His advisors, not least Carlos Prats, were often staggered at Allende's indifference and belief that negotiation would trump force. He was an idealist rather than a pragmatist, and his position as President of Chile would likely never have remained his in any capacity, even in a democratic environment. In the words of Edward Corey, he had neither the temperament nor the intellectual experience to sustain systemic management, and his top-down approach to the Chilean economy and society incurred heavy opposition to his government, and the United States only magnified the animosity. As such, in the absence of unimpeachable evidence, we cannot condemn the United States for what it has always claimed it had not done. But what we can do is condemn them for close to a decade of economic and political meddling that aimed to atomize Chilean sovereign institutions and manipulate its political system. The United States may not have been the architect of Allende's demise, but it most certainly put the wind in the sails of his opposition, and became an important informal actor, in the words of Sebastián Hurtado Torres. It did not fabricate an opposition to Allende, one already existed, but it did facilitate them, and it most certainly violated Chilean sovereignty and the independence of its political system. The death of Allende, although tempting to blame completely on the United States, was a result of domestic factors exacerbated by the likes of the CIA, and as such, America can only be indicted on accessory to the demise of Chilean democracy, which by all interpretations remains reprehensible. Ultimately, the cloaked hand of US interventionism, furtive and sly, keeps its secrets but yields to its lesser acts and shakes the hand of the devil. As Dean Acheson once said, whoever runs China, even if it be the devil himself, is infinitely better than if he is a stooge of Moscow. It appears then that the United States got their devil in Chile.